who aren't members of the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee to attend this meeting if they wish. It is a subject of interest to a great many Assembly members. So we do have some others in addition to the 3 who are on the Budget Subcommittee attending today. Feel free to participate in the meeting. The only bit you won't be able to participate on is if there are any votes on anything. That will be restricted solely to the 3 regular members of the committee. Other than that, we'll treat you just the same. Can I welcome members, invited guests and members of the public to this meeting. The main topic of the discussion is the London Stadium. We've got a couple of short items of business to whiz through first. If members of the public are watching and they want to tweet or anything about this, please use the hashtag London Stadium for this meeting. All members of the subcommittee are present and correct, I can see, so we've had no apologies for absence. Declarations of interest. We're recommended to note the list of offices held by Assembly members and to declare any other disclosable pecuniary interests in specific items listed on the agenda. Assembly Member Deval.
I'm not sure if I should declare this, but I will, just for the sake of this meeting, that I'm a season ticket holder of West Ham United Football Club.
Assembly Member Desai.
And I'm a trustee of West Ham United Foundation.
Okay, thank you very much. Nothing from any other members. Okay, item 3 is the minutes of the meeting that was held on the 13th of December 2017. Are they agreed as a correct record?
Yes.
Thank you, members. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. The subcommittee is recommended to note the completed and outstanding actions arising from previous meetings of the Budget Monitoring Subcommittee. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 5, main item of business today, is to discuss the London Stadium and specifically the Moore Stephens report that we previously looked at in December 2017. I would like to very much welcome our guests, Neale Coleman, CBE, and David Edmonds, CBE, both making welcome returns to City Hall and both considerably upping the honours that are present in the room today. You've outranked everyone, and the weight is clearly on that end of the room. Right, welcome both of you, gentlemen. Now, back in December 2017, when the report was issued, we had Moore Stephens and the Mayor's Chief of Staff appeared in front of us, and there were various questions that we asked them off the back of that report. It was very critical, as we know, of the decisions that were taken that led into the present situation. It focused very much on historic events, not quite so much on the way forward, and we will look at some of those issues today. But firstly, I think as a scene setter, it would be interesting to know what you both felt of the Moore Stephens conclusions. Shall we start with you, Neale?
Well, they obviously had, I think, quite a difficult task. They had quite a short period of time to cover, a long period, a great deal of quite complicated legal, technical, operational and other issues. I thought a lot of their analysis was right. I think, they confirmed, one point which I think is probably mainly common ground, and when they said that only a Premier League football club would be able to provide a long-term mass audience legacy for the stadium. And I think experience around the world with other Olympic cities demonstrates that that was true. I think they therefore agreed that it was necessary to abandon the original 25,000 seat legacy option. I think they also agreed that the decision to not to opt for the Tottenham Hotspur proposal was the correct one. I think they said it would have failed to provide an adequate athletics legacy and might have caused a public outcry. And they do make an obvious point, which was that in the discussions with West Ham had a very strong negotiating position as they were the only player in the game once Tottenham had gone. I think where I find the report a little less convincing is in some of the issues where they talk about what might have been done differently. No one can be entirely happy with the current position with the stadium, particularly the issues that have arisen with the seating. But you need to go back and look at what might have been done differently and the choices that were available. And I think there are 2 things that they say specifically, with hindsight, should have been done differently. One is they say that the first competition shouldn't have been abandoned at the time that it was, and they say that's a with hindsight judgment. And the second thing that they say is that at the time of the second competition, no preferred bidders should have been named. And they expressly say both of those are judgments made with hindsight, and inevitably the report was written with hindsight. I actually think, with hindsight, I don't agree really with those 2 conclusions of theirs. I think that at the time the first competition was abandoned, you have to think about the broader context within which the mayor and ministers were making decisions at that time. We were 8 or 9 months before the Olympic opening ceremony. We were about to go to a contest for the World Athletics Championships, to host that had been under discussion for very many months with the International Amateur Athletics Federation, probably the most important international federation in terms of the games. I think no mayor, frankly, in my view, and no minister would have taken a decision that involved London abandoning the IAAF event, particularly bearing in mind that London had abandoned it once before with Pickett's Lock. You would have had an international outcry over that. It would have been immensely damaging in the run-up to the Games, and you would have been going into the Games with no way forward on the stadium. I also think they underestimate the impact of the state aid issues around that first competition. I think they say at one stage that they're not in a position to explore the legal aspects of the state aid issue, and one thing they don't do actually is analyse the legal advice that people were getting at the time. There was a very real danger, I think, that the litigation over state aid on the first competition might have ended up in a bad place. There was certainly no telling how long it would take. And one of the things which I think we tried to do throughout, on advice, there were Alan Overy, 2 QCs advising LLDC throughout this period, was to be very risk-averse about state aid challenges. And I think that was right, because we could have ended up in a position where we'd actually spent the money on the stadium, had a successful state aid challenge. I mean, we know there were people about willing to litigate, and we would have spent the money and no one would have been able to use the stadium. I think the more fundamental problem with what they say here, and it bears on a point I know you wanted to talk about, namely the public sector solution for the game, for the stadium, and why that was adopted, is they say that the virtue of the first competition and the West Ham Newham bid was that it was a private sector solution and it passed all the risk to the private sector. Well, I mean, it didn't, because Newham were parties to that bid. It wasn't a pure private sector bid, it was a public sector bid. And also it was a bid, it was never a deal. I think Moore Stephens, with a degree of justice, later questioned some of the estimates that were made on the second competition. But if you look at the first competition and you look at the detail of what West Ham Newham was saying, they said they were going to spend £32.5 million on the stadium. That was all the money they were going to spend. Now, we know now that that wouldn't have bought you anything. So what would have happened if you had gone down that route, which they say one should have gone down? You would have ended up in a position where the bill was much higher, where inevitably there would have been demands both on Newham and I suspect on the mayor and the GLA to come in and put more money into that. And I don't think they really addressed that issue. So I think I don't agree with that. I think on the second point, the point about whether we shouldn't have named any preferred bidders, I think that's an odd conclusion to reach, because if you hadn't named any preferred bidders, you'd have had to stop there and then, and you never would have had a negotiation. I think we can argue about the negotiation and its outcome, but I don't think it would have been right to name no preferred bidder. There was clear advice that they should be named, and I think you had to do that in order to get into a negotiation. So as I say, I mean, I think it's a very full report. It's packed with information. I think at the end of the day, you come back to the point, what was the choice that had to be made in 2013 eventually, and query some decisions that led up to that. But when we got to 2013, the choice, and it's set out in one of the pages of the report, was did you go for a proper stadium that would be UEFA compliant, where you could stage Premier League football, where you could expect a mass audience, or would you go for a stadium that effectively still had the temporary toilets that were there, that had no turnstiles, that had nothing there, that probably by now you wouldn't have been able to use for any events? And I think that was a pretty stark choice, and to be honest, I think the right choice was made there. I'm not saying everything went as it should have done. Plainly it didn't. Plainly there remain issues that need to be dealt with. But I think the fundamental choice was the right one.
There's lots in that we will unpick as the meeting unfolds. So members don't indicate at this stage. We'll come to much of that in the future questioning. David, your response to the Moore Stevens report?
I think I would concur with all that Neale has said. I think there is a lot of value in the report. There's a lot of historic detail. There's a lot of analysis. From my perspective, having sat through scores, I should think, of investment committee meetings and board meetings, I probably dispute a little bit the thesis that there wasn't sufficient information on which we should make decisions. I think if you were probably to look back at the amount of money we spent on lawyers, accountants and other advisors, and if you looked at the depth of the material in some of those papers, we were we had a lot of advice. Some of that advice, with hindsight again, proved not to be correct, but we had the advice at the time, so I think it's a bit harsh to criticise the board for that. Where I do agree is the bit in their introduction where it says the stadium is a telltale for the success of the park, and when the stadium prospers, it's likely that the surrounding areas will prosper. I profoundly believe that to be the case. I argued in front of this committee, in front of this assembly before, that the creation of, well, perhaps the most successful legacy Olympic area that's ever been seen in any country in the world, I think much of that is now actually beginning to be shown on the ground. So I don't think time will tell. I think time is already telling. If you look at the success of Here East, I was talking to the guy who runs that only the other day. Fantastic success. And he says, yeah, having the stadium, having a functioning, effective stadium just to the other side of the park is a great symbol of what's happening down here. So I'm a profound believer in that what we tried to do in the LLDC, with the support of mayors of both parties, was for the public good. I accept the report says in numbers of areas we miscalculated the impact of some of the decisions we took. But I think on balance, and looking at it from the overall context, it was the right thing to do. I think building the stadium in the way in which we did was the right decision. And I'm very proud, actually, to be honest, of the work that the LLDC and the colleagues I work within that organisation achieved over those years.
This question is probably to both of you, because again, there's a lot in what you've just said, David, that we will unpick in a moment. Why do you think the Mayor commissioned the review?
Sorry?
Why do you think the Mayor commissioned the review?
It's an interesting question. I think the Mayor commissioned the review because in the autumn time of 16, new numbers were coming out in terms of the costs, particularly of the running costs of the stadium. I think the Mayor commissioned the review because there was an anxiety within his staff that the numbers were more than he thought. I suspect they wondered why the capital costs had risen as they did. Interestingly, inside the organisation, before I left, I'd already suggested that we did a review. I'd been very happy to do a review. I had hoped that it would be a review that we would do internally. I think we could have done an effective review with some external help. So, yeah, I mean, I think a review probably was necessary in order to put the material together in the way, or the data together in a way that gave at least some explanation to the new administration of where we got to.
That being so, why did you decline to participate in the Moore Stevens review?
For the reasons that I almost just gave you. I've spent 33 years of my 40 years as an executive or administrator working inside a bureaucracy. I believe, on the whole, that the people inside the organisations I've worked with have got a great degree of integrity and a great degree of skill. I'm very suspicious of bringing in an outsider who knows nothing about history. And I think if you go through this report, there's an awful lot of history, but it's only still a partial history. I lived through all of those boards, all of those committees. I'd have been perfectly happy to work with inside the LLDC as I was before I left, in terms of producing can't use the word dossier at the moment, but an analysis of where we'd got to, why we'd got to, and some conclusions arising from it with external critical scrutiny. I think it's a better way of doing public administration rather than hiring somebody in from the outside who then took what, 9 months to produce a lot of historical data. That's why I refused.
You think that as the outgoing chairman, who had, as you just said, lived through it, you would have had quite a good amount to input to that?
That's possibly true. I think you could say that. Indeed, I probably would have done. But I did feel very strongly that this was not, in my view, from my own experience, the right way of looking at what had happened inside the organisation in which I'd played a part for 7-8 years, of which I'd been chairman for a year. And it was a personal view, and I held it very strongly, which is why I declined the offer to give evidence or to talk to Mr. Moore-Stevens, or Mr. whatever he's called.
Okay. And I think other members might want to pick that up as we go through the meeting. Same question to you, Neale, really. Why did you feel the Mayor commissioned it and your role in it?
Well, I can only really go on the basis of what was said at the time, which is that it was done in response to I don't know exactly the sequence of events by which this became apparent and who it became apparent to when, but there was a 272 million announcement, I think while I was still actually involved in LLDC, and subsequently I think a 323 million announcement was made in November 2016. I think it's quite possible that announcement could have been made earlier, but I wasn't around. I don't know how that happened. And it was said that because that had occurred, that was the reason why there should be a review. I think, as it turned out, and I think probably rightly, the review actually didn't concentrate so much on that issue, and I think indeed Moore-Stevens' conclusion on that issue were that, I don't entirely agree with their conclusion, but I can see why they came to it, that, you know, that wasn't an unreasonable amount. One might have expected that was how much it would cost in any event. And much more of the focus, I think, was on the operational, the revenue position, the things looking forward. And you could say that was a good thing, really, because that's really the nub of what needs to be addressed today, rather than the historic issue of the capital cost, which is sunk now, for better or worse. So all I can say is that's what was said. I've no reason to doubt that.
I agree with what you've just said. The final part you said about there being two main issues, the capital cost, which is historic, and the ongoing revenue cost, which is as we say, ongoing. On the capital cost side of things, in your opening remarks, you said that you welcomed the fact that Moore-Stevens had acknowledged that a Premier League football club in that stadium was the best option. I think there are many people, including many people on this side of the table, who, right from the early stages, thought that was inevitably going to have to be the outcome to avoid a white elephant. That being so, and the location of the stadium meaning that it's almost certainly going to be West Ham if they could be interested in coming away from the Boleyn ground, why do you think it was that the stadium was not built for legacy in the first place, which would have saved all the capital cost of conversion?
Well, this is a question that I think has been discussed many times in meetings in this chamber, and I normally refer you back to, I think, what David Higgins said, and I couldn't give you chapter and verse, but it was certainly David Higgins, who was the chief executive of the ODA at the time, who came in and I think gave the most convincing explanation of why that was. And I'll try and do it, and I don't dissent from what David said. I think, you know, if you had been able to do that, clearly there would have been advantages in doing that. You would have ended up inevitably having to build it with retractable seating, you know, that you could have perhaps purpose-built. You could have done it a bit more like Stade de France. That would have, you know, probably added 100, 150 million to the cost. I think you need to go back again with all these decisions and think about the context within which they were taken. And the decision essentially not to do that was taken at a time when we had just seen the Olympic budget go up from, whether you call it 2, 3 or 4 million, there's billion rather not million, there's always disputes about that, up to 9.3 billion. It had gone up sharply. Quite a lot of criticism about that. It's probably actually a good decision because it gave you the contingency to deliver the Olympics. The first quotes for the Olympic Stadium that came in from McAlpines, from memory, were well in excess of 600 million, way over budget. And there was a very difficult and complex process that had to be gone through, which I wasn't involved in, but which David Higgins and the ODA team were involved in to get that down. At the same time, there were discussions at the time with West Ham United, because, as you say, that was the most obvious way to go. And in particular, there was an attempt to see would West Ham agree to put up money to meet the extra cost, bearing in mind we already had to get down from a figure that couldn't be afforded rather than putting in another 100 million. And you were also right up against a timetable here, and a design timetable that if you hadn't met, you would have got into some of the difficulties that actually occurred on the subsequent works, where if you get right up against the end date, A, you can't do your test events, B, you're in difficulty with your contractor. I mean, there was a letter from people who were involved in West Ham at the time which said they might provide some money, but there was no willingness at all by West Ham to enter into anything that was legally binding or could have been relied upon at the time. I think you also need to bear in mind that had there been such an offer, it would have come from the people who at the time owned West Ham, who subsequently went bankrupt in the Icelandic banking crash. And frankly, had we had the Olympic Stadium involved in the Icelandic bank liquidation, I think we would have been in real trouble. And I think the judgment was made that it was prudent to proceed as was. And that's why the 25,000 seat option was decided upon as the legacy, knowing that it wasn't perfect. Now, you know, again, it's easy to second guess. I actually think that there was no other decision that people were reasonably going to make at the time, given the overall budgetary position and so on, and given the failure of West Ham or anyone else to come forward with anything that was actually bankable in terms of the additional costs that would have been required. So it was a difficult decision, but I think it was probably the only decision that could have been made at the time.
The template that could have been followed, and this has been kicked around before as well, was the City of Manchester Stadium that was built for the Commonwealth Games with legacy in mind, which was always going to be that Manchester City go there, the council own it, and City pay rent and play there. Why was that not deemed in any way to be a feasible option for London?
It was a much easier thing at Manchester. The design issues were much easier there than they were in London. I mean, the cost issues were much easier than they were in London. You could have done that, but I mean, you would have effectively you would have been doing what you effectively did in Manchester, which was to hand them the stadium.
What I'm getting at, Mr. Coleman, I'm trying to work out why that worked there and was deemed not to work here. I mean, I of course take your point that hindsight is always 20/20. It's always perfect in hindsight. But some of these arguments were being made at the time that decisions were being made. They
were. It would have been a possible option to do that. You would have immensely complicated your design, because in Manchester you dug down to, here you couldn't do that because of the contamination. I'm not to say it couldn't have been done.
The point is, though, the stadium has had to be retrofitted to make it fit Premier League rules, part of which involved, of course, taking off the roof and rebuilding it.
But not...
That could have been done right from the off. You didn't need to necessarily do that.
No, you're right. You could have done that. You would have had a significant extra bill, and you would have had to effectively accept that was all going to be on the public sector. Maybe that should... I mean, that is an option that could have been followed. I think you would have still got into some difficulty with the owners of West Ham, and I think you would have had, there would have been. I mean, there's been enough fuss, and it's mentioned in this report about what is seen as giving West Ham a bit of a gold-plated deal here. I think what you're suggesting is that we should effectively have spent an extra £150 million on the stadium, and that we should have then given it to West Ham. I mean, I think an option you could have followed, and I think if we were going down the road you suggest, it's actually not dissimilar to the options that were taken in respect of some of the German World Cup stadiums, where of course you didn't have the field of play issue. But if you look at what happened with the Dusseldorf or the Cologne stadiums, there they were effectively built with public money. They were held in the public sector, and then they were let to the football clubs, generally on pretty generous terms, with, in most cases, naming rights deals and other events coming in. Yes, you could have done that. You would have had to deal with the design issues and with that. It would have been something you could have done. I think, given the constraints there were on time, on the tendering, on all that, the judgment was made by the people at the ODA not to do that, that was simpler and more certain in terms of delivery. And I do think, you know, and maybe this is wrong. I mean, I'm not trying to say I'm definitely on one side or the other of this. Maybe when push came to shove with decisions around the games, we always talked about games and legacy, and I think we did do a lot about legacy as well, you know, so legacy was thought about. But always people knew that if you didn't deliver a very good Olympic Games, you could forget about a legacy. And therefore, if you were putting at risk delivery of the venues on time, in time to do the test events, people were risk averse about that.
I mean, I think the suggestion that I was putting to you is that we had a relatively recent example of how you can build for this, which was the City of Manchester Stadium. That, whilst taking your point that there would have been additional cost over and above what the Olympic Stadium cost to build for the Olympics, it would still have worked out cheaper than having to retrofit the stadium, which was almost the cost of a new stadium. And that we could potentially have been slightly more long-term in our thinking around that than we ultimately ended up being, because a lot of the focus, and again, I take your point, the focus had to be on delivering a good Olympics. That was first and foremost the most important thing, granted. But the focus was solely on that to the exclusion of legacy, which has ended up costing a lot of money. And also, because we didn't follow the example that there was in Manchester, it's landed us with a very big bill, because in Manchester, Manchester City have significantly more control over how the stadium operates than West Ham United do. I mean, I've seen press releases referring to West Ham United Stadium, and of course it's not their stadium.
It's not their stadium.
And that is part of the problem in terms of the revenue costs that we now have. Do you accept that?
Well, yes, except that I do accept that. I do think that the decision, I do think they're not strictly comparable. I think that what you say is an absolutely fair point. I mean, it's a point made by others, as you say. I mean, I've had this self-same discussion with Richard Caborn, who was sports minister at the time, who I think has made no secret of the fact that he thinks something like what you're saying could and should have been done. I mean, to be honest, this decision, the actual decision was well above my pay grade. I can say that. Tessa Jowl overruled Dick Caborn at the time. I think with some and there were some very good and cogent reasons why she did. As for whether one would want to pass full ownership of the stadium over to West Ham and full control, I'm not so sure about that. I mean, I think that one of the points, one of the potential advantages of the stadium, of which we've seen some benefits, but which I think you could get greater benefits from, is its potential to be a multi-use stadium, and its potential. I mean, I think it is probably by common consent about the best stadium in Europe for staging concerts in, because of access and other issues. We obviously had the World Athletics Championships there, which was a phenomenal event and which one needs to bear in mind, a huge economic benefit to London from that. And whether you would actually have wanted to end up with an Olympic stadium without a substantial measure of public sector control, public sector ownership, I don't know. But you could have done that within the scenario you're describing. You could have done it by way of a lease or a concession agreement similar to the one that was actually put in place. So I don't, I think I'm not saying I disagree fundamentally with you. I think it was a difficult decision. A call was made, which I think put very much Olympic delivery, lack of risk, lack of overspend, those sorts of issues in first place, you know, you could have taken a different view.
I think, again, there's more stuff in there, particularly around the way forward, which we'll come back and pick up with you a bit later on. I'm going to throw it open now to other members. I think Assembly Member Arnold?
Yes. Neale, you started with your introduction about past decisions.
Yeah.
And you shared with us your, I'll just use the word unease about Moore Stevens' comments about the first and second competition. What else, knowing what we know now, would you have done differently with the stadium?
Well, with hindsight, yes.
Go for it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think with hindsight, I think actually, and I actually go rather the reverse to Moore Stevens, I think we should have gone for a public sector solution in the first place, in fact. Because I think we ended up there, and I think actually we were always going to be in problems in state aid in going the other way. And once people started litigating, you know, you're in difficulty there. And I think, as I said, I've talked about the German experience, which I think was very good. And I think if one had started earlier with a public sector solution, some of the things we had to do because we were under time pressure, in particular, making decisions about end users before we'd looked at the operating model and before we'd run a procurement for the operator, that, I think, was, if we'd done it the other way round, I think that would have been better. Because, I mean, one of the problems we had, and one of the problems about the costs and so on, is that we ended up making decisions on the end users before we'd actually been able to cost on the basis of real numbers the operating costs and the operating model for the stadium. We took advice, as David's referred to. We took advice from the people who we were told were the best people in the business to advise us on stadium operating costs. But we were always going to be dependent on the outcome of the procurement for the operator in part for this, assuming we weren't going to try and run it ourselves, which I'm sure we were right not to do. And I think if we had done that, we would have been in a much better position. I suspect it might have led to some, perhaps a year's further delay, probably. And, you know, this is where, again, we were constantly, obviously, under pressure, both publicly and actually also from West Ham. They wanted to get it, if they were going to have a new stadium, they wanted to get in there as quickly as possible. And the time pressures that we were under throughout this period, you know, were one of the things we had to contend with. Again, with hindsight, looking back, we should probably have relaxed about that a bit and given ourselves a bit more time. And I do think that, you know, that would have meant that we would have sorted out the operating issues better. Now, plainly, with hindsight, you know, we wouldn't have wanted to have had the problems with the seats. I must admit, I'm still not 100% sure why the problems with the seats were as grave as they were. You know, there were arrangements in place. Certainly from my time there, I never foresaw what eventually happened with the seating system. But that clearly is a big issue. I mean, you've got three problems, haven't you, really, now? I mean, you've got three big problems with which mean that the stadium isn't doing as well as it should financially. Mm-hmm. One is the seats, two is the lack of a naming rights deal as yet, and three is, and linked with the seats, is there could be more events in there. There's no doubt there could be more public events in there. And as I say, I do think that taking a bit more time, doing a procurement for the operator first, working out the operational stuff first, that would probably have been a better thing to do.
And then you talked a bit, in answer to my colleague, about the decision finally to go with the public sector-led solution. Now, who took that final decision?
Well, I think
you
it was a
recall?
decision taken by the board of the Olympic Park Legacy Company, but I think it would have been a decision that certainly had support from ministers and the mayor at the time. So, I mean, and I think, as the report makes clear, one very large factor in that decision certainly was the staging of the World Athletics Championships and the need to provide a degree of certainty over that. I think it's also worth saying that, I mean, if you read the report, it's also the case there'd been a letter from Newham Council, essentially as part of the West Ham Newham Consortium, saying that they were no longer able to meet the requirements of the competition. In face of that, I think it was December 2011 the decision was made. But it was certainly a decision in which both the Mayor and the Secretary of State and the Sports Minister at the time would have had a major say.
They would have had to have agreed that.
Yeah.
I mean, at the time, do you think the legal challenges, there was a legal challenge from Tottenham, Leyton Orient, and the anonymous state aid complaint to the European Commission, do you think there was a sense where, oh my goodness, this thing is going to get bogged down in all of this legalities?
Yeah, I think that, you know, if one had persisted with the litigation, I mean, who knows what would have happened. I do think there was real concern about the state aid point. There'd been a lot of other things going on. There'd been the business which had happened with a member of staff at the LLDC having been found out to have been associated with someone at West Ham. Obviously wasn't very helpful, though. The litigation, the outcome was uncertain. I think the one thing you could be certain about was that it was likely to be protracted.
Yes.
We were going to have to go to the High Court. Whatever happened in the High Court, they were very likely to end up having to go to the Court of Appeal. You were talking, I mean, who knows how long it would have taken, but these things can take 18 months, 2 years, without too much difficulty. So certainly that was in people's minds. And I think, you know, I, as I said, I think in what I said at the beginning, I think sort of 8 months before the Games, to be in a position where, A, you were saying we can't run this athletics championships that we've been talking to you about for ages, and B, well, we don't know what's going to happen with the stadium until all these court cases are out of the way, which may be another 18 months down the road. I don't think, as I say, I don't think any mayor or any set of ministers would have been content with that.
And of course, you had a relationship with the current mayor, the successive mayor, if you like. Well, you were involved with 3 mayors on this project.
Yes, less with the current one than the previous 2, but a little bit.
Yes, yeah. And that was, I wanted to know, in terms of steer, because you were seen, certainly by myself and others, as the mayor's person on the board. So did you get extra steer from successive mayors, like at all costs, let's go for the public sector? What steer did you get from
Well, I think, certainly throughout this period, there was, from the mayor's point of view, whether it was Ken Livingstone or Boris Johnson, the Olympics and everything to do with it was probably, number 1 or 2 on their list of things that they were concerned with. So, the idea that they let me just get on with what I fancied wouldn't have been on. Obviously, subsequently the mayor himself, Boris, chaired the LLDC for quite a long period of time, reflecting his great interest in the Olympic legacy. And so, yes, I mean, all fundamental strategic decisions around things like this would have been taken essentially by the mayor directly. I mean, it doesn't say you didn't advise them or discuss it with them in detail and give your own view. Obviously you would. But these were mayoral, plainly mayoral decisions they were. And indeed often ministerial decisions as well, because often you were talking not just about the mayor, but government ministers needing to sign off as well.
There was that sure commitment. The mayor chaired the board and made the last call on decisions.
Well, yeah, but with the support of the board, you know, and I mean, I think it's important to, certainly, you know, when I was involved with LLDC, it had a very, I think, a very strong and capable board, you know, and there weren't ciphers, you know, we had people on the board who had, technically, who had managed out the last stages of the Wembley Stadium and who had built the Anschutz development at the O2. We had people who had been responsible for the development and delivery of Arsenal's new stadium. We had people who had run some of the most successful events in the world. We had David, who's you know, in his past life built, you know, probably 20 or 30 big buildings in the city. You know,
in London anyway.
In London. I mean, you know, these are, you know, we had the mayor of Newham, we had the mayor of Hackney, the leader of Tower Hamlets. These, you know, these are not ciphers. So I think, obviously, the views of the mayor of London at all times had a lot of weight, but these were decisions which the board as a whole were party to.
Thank you. And again to you, David, because just following on from what Neale has just told us, which information to be welcomed, all of this expertise sitting there, but you said earlier that it was clear that there was miscalculations, that the advice that was given, there could have been better advice. So
no, if I said that, I didn't quite mean that. What I think the big issue, and Neale's just touched on it, is the impact of the seating decisions on the ongoing costs for the stadium. I mean, the other issue is to do with naming rights and then events. But when I look back, my years on the board, we had very good advice, which we thought at the time was the right advice. In hindsight and retrospect, it turned not out to be right. The first decision on the seats was taken on the basis of going to the market and saying, here's a specification. We need seats that you can run forward and you can wrap back for athletics. Can you do it? The contractor who actually won that deal proved unable to meet what he said he was able to do and went bust. Following that, many of the problems that led to more investment, different solutions, and now what appears to be a quite weighty cost in terms of seat moves back and two, followed that initial decision to go with that particular contractor. And whether it was a mistake or not on our part, maybe it was, maybe we weren't thorough enough, maybe we hadn't thought through enough at the time. But from that rests a lot of the problems.
I was just going to say, in terms of that experience, reflecting back, do you think there was enough due diligence? I mean, because it's such a bespoke area, we recognise that, but, you know, can you say that really there would have been opportunities to have checked that out a little bit more?
I think in any board, with respect, if you take a set of decisions and they go wrong, you think afterwards I could have asked more questions. I think at the time, again, actually, Neale has made the point, we were always working against a particular deadline. I don't think we were negligent, no suggestion of us being negligent. I think we had papers came to board, we looked at the papers, we endorsed. Everything went through the investment committee of the LLDC, then went to the main board, and the big decisions, again, as Neale's just pointed out, would come here. That, I think, we do take responsibility for, and in retrospect, clearly, we got it wrong. We probably did get it wrong, yes.
Yeah.
And just touching again on this ongoing SOAR, the decision to go with the private sector, because you're the public sector, because you're a private sector board, aren't you? So were you involved in that decision?
Well, the whole board was. At the end of the day, the whole board had a paper, a submission that we agreed, that which then went on to the mayor. And my recollection is to ministers. My view is that we ended up in a very complicated solution with, it's quasi-private, partly private sector, partly public sector. We've got the LLDC, we've got the E20 board, we've got Newham's involvement, we've got the GLA's involvement, we've got West Ham's involvement. Is that a private sector solution or is that a hybrid solution? And I think the hybridity, if I may so describe it, has led to some of the problems we've had subsequently in having a coherent route forward. It's very difficult to manage a situation where you've got at least 6 and maybe more players sitting around a table, or sometimes not sitting around a table, sometimes sitting in another building, trying to run something as complex as a stadium conversion.
I do think, though, that I'd just like to go back on this point to what I said at the beginning. The idea that there was in place a private sector solution that would have borne all the risk in the private sector and never involved any call on the public sector is fanciful and not the case. There never was any such solution. There was a proposition, an initial proposition from West Ham and Newham quintessentially a public sector body, that was never negotiated through, and that when you look at it now, clearly wasn't the initial bid is one that had no chance of ever being successfully implemented, in that they were talking, as I say, about spending 32.5 million. That was all they were going to spend on the stadium. Now, that would never have worked. There would have been a demand for more money. And to be honest, I'm not sure that West Ham would have stepped forward in that situation. And so it was. I think the ways, but we had this private sector solution that they were taking all the risk. It was all fixed price. It was never going to cost us anything. That isn't right. That didn't exist. It never existed.
Yeah, so, and just one thing, because in papers in front of us, coming out of the Moore-Stevens report, it said that financial value for money was the justification about the stadium design, and that the OPLC gave finances a 40% weighting in its decisions. That was in 2010. By 2012, when West Ham became the preferred bidder, this weighting was 50%. So was the decision made at that time then that the cost and the risk, if it arose, would be fine after? Do you see what I mean? Rather than putting in the monies and building for legacy. It's just, if somebody could just say somebody made that decision, then that would really round it off for me. It's just like, it just seems nobody made the choice and say, well, we won't put the money in first. We'll just work on this pathway, leave the risk with the GLA after, as we've ended up.
Well, I think it was almost inevitable in this situation. Given the earlier decision, which Gareth was, questioning, and the fact that you did then have to do a rebuild of the stadium, I think it was almost inevitable that a substantial part of that cost, the majority of that cost, would fall on the public sector. I think, without sort of broadening the discussion too much, if you look at what's happened everywhere else in the world, the Olympic Stadium is difficult to find a legacy for, because nobody needs a 60 or 80,000 seat athletic stadium, and the field of play is different, and all the sight lines are different, and all that. So what's happened elsewhere? In Brazil, the Maracana's been looted and is lying a ruin, and the power's been cut off, and it's a disaster. In Beijing, the only of big sporting events that have happened there, other than the World Athletics Championships, have been friendlies between Arsenal and Chelsea and Arsenal and Manchester City. In Athens, they have got a football club in there, but they're moving out. In Barcelona, they had a football club in there, but they're moving out. In Sydney, they now want to knock down the stadium, and the New South Wales government is planning to spend £1 billion on rebuilding it. And that is an investment in sporting infrastructure in the city. In Germany, the World Cup stadiums were built with public money and then leased. And I think, you know, when you're talking about the scale of investment that's involved here, it is very rare that football clubs can do this. We have seen them do it in London. We've seen Arsenal and now Tottenham Hotspur do it, but they've been very risky and difficult ventures, and they've involved huge amounts of money. I think in this situation, given what people were talking about, it was almost inevitable that if you were going to produce a stadium that had the capacity to stage Premiership football, Champions League football one day, who knows, you know, you had to, it was very, very likely that the public sector was going to have to step in and take the lion's share of the risk and the cost of doing that. I think there are great benefits in that, if you can get it right, if you can solve some of the problems we've had here. And I think the biggest benefit is the one David talked about when he was starting, which is the overall impact and importance of the stadium for the overall legacy of the park and the economic benefits that we've seen there, and which continue to flow there. And I think that's the overriding reason why it was a good thing to do.
My last question is to David. In your role, what steer did you get from the mayor, if any? Because the mayor was the chair, but you also had a similar leading position. But what steer did you get or didn't get from the mayor?
It was the other way around, actually. The board, the investment committee and the E20 board took a view. Those views were then expressed, whether it was a revision of a contract, whether it was a new development, were then put on the board table at the LLDC main board, and they were then sent on, endorsed by the mayor when they were of that size. We had delegated authorities and we did things on our own. But it was us giving material to the mayor
E20
to take
feeding.
decisions. Well, E20, LLDC, E20 didn't go direct to the mayor, that went through the board of the LLDC. And the mayor, where it was big enough, would take the decision. So the point was, I think all of us, certainly the non-elected members of the board, you know, we'd not been elected by anybody, we'd been appointed. We saw it as our job to provide logical, work-through advice through the board to the mayor, and that's, I think, what we did.
Thank you.
Okay, I've seen Assemblymember Boff.
Thank you. Mr. Coleman, did you receive advice prior to the first competition that it was that competition was likely to result in breaking state aid rules?
No, we didn't. I think, as the report makes clear, we had advice from Eversheds that, although there was risk associated with it, that it was likely that they thought on balance there were strong arguments that it was state aid compliant.
So they were the ones that you didn't receive any other information?
We had advice at that stage.
Just from
Eversheds were advising LLDC at that stage. I think their advice is given in the report.
But you're now saying that actually it was quite. Are you saying it's quite obvious that it would have failed? If
I'm not saying it's quite obvious that it was failed. I'm saying there was concern
Just concern.
about the dangers of the state aid point, and there was subsequent advice by the lawyers advising Allen and Overy about ways in which one should try and ensure that one did avoid the risks of state aid challenge.
Did you receive subsequent advice after the first competition was abandoned that the second competition might also be a problem in terms of state aid?
No, we received very detailed advice from Allen and Overy, who were then the lawyers advising LLDC about how to avoid risks of state aid, of falling down on state aid. The advice that they gave was very much directed to avoiding a successful challenge. Clearly, nobody can ever give you 100% advice, but we had advice that we complied with their advice. We were very cautious about this, so in addition to taking advice from Allen and Overy had 2 QCs to assist them in supporting their advice about state aid.
So did you receive anything from Steve Lawrence, who raised the original, I mean it was anonymous at the time, it's not now, but Steve Lawrence, who raised the original objection on state aid, did you ever receive any advice from him?
I don't recall receiving any advice from him. It's the first time I've heard his name.
Okay. Did you receive advice that the requirement for keeping the athletics track could cause problems for hosting football?
Well, I think it was common ground by everyone that one of the issues that had to be addressed was the large field of play and the sightlines. I mean, I think that was common. I mean, everyone knew that.
So it was established that it wasn't a problem. I mean, did you ever consider not having a track?
Well,
did
you mean did I personally, or
was it ever considered not having?
Well, clearly it was considered in that the Tottenham Hotspur bid didn't have a track, so it was considered.
Only when Tottenham Hotspurs forced that on you. I mean,
Well, we've had this discussion in this room before, Andrew,
yes.
and you know,
one of the signs of madness is to repeat
the
the same behaviour time and time again.
You know, it is
I
the
didn't
case.
get the right answer last
It is the case that both Ken Livingstone and Boris Johnson, and it was both them personally, took the view, rightly or wrongly, that the commitments London had made to the International Olympic Committee and the International Federation to retain an athletics legacy in London had to be honoured.
Yes.
May I?
That's not quite the question.
What is the question?
It was whether or not an athletics track at the stadium. Of course, we had to have an athletics legacy.
Well, indeed.
Nobody has ever denied that.
Well,
it was
indeed.
this requirement to have it in the stadium.
Well, indeed. I think if there had ever been a proposal that would have provided a satisfactory athletics legacy that had not been in the stadium, then that should and would have been very seriously considered. I think it is one of the issues.
I've never had that proposal put to you, apart from the Tottenham Hotspur's bid.
Apart from the Tottenham Hotspur proposal, because to provide, I mean, the obvious point was that
I put the proposal to you. I just didn't do a spec. But
well, there was the obvious proposal in relation to this would be that one would have provided it at Crystal Palace.
Yeah, absolutely.
That was the obvious
the
obvious proposal that one should have put it at Crystal Palace. And you know, I'm stretching my memory, but the costs of doing up Crystal Palace to provide an adequate legacy, and you may quibble with these, but you were talking about certainly between 60 and 100 million pounds as a minimum.
It saves time.
Yeah, well, maybe. But unfortunately, when Spurs put forward their proposal, they weren't planning to spend that much on Crystal Palace. They never offered anything remotely approaching that for Crystal Palace.
Just to get this clear, because you know, we might not be able to call you back again. So just
I'm always happy to come back.
Just to get this clear, not having the track in the stadium was never seriously considered until we got the Tottenham Hotspur's bid.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I can't remember anyone putting that forward. No one in DCMS, no one here. I mean, I don't remember anyone suggesting that until we had the Spurs bid.
I was just going to add.
I beg your pardon.
No,
Sorry,
not at all. Not at all. Sir. It's going back an awfully long time, and so I was involved in discussion at the time. I was involved in helping to draft the consultation document we put out on the future use of the stadium. I was there when we interviewed Tottenham Hotspur on their bid. My perception as an ordinary board member was that it would be unacceptable in any circumstance for us not to have an athletics track within the stadium, given the commitments that had been made to Sebastian Coe and others in previous years.
And as I think I said at the time, we also made a commitment that the marathon route would be through the East End, but they cut that off quick enough. So, you know, and kind of lost the whole justification for the Olympics for me, but still. Did you ever do a cost-benefit analysis of hosting the IAAF in 2017 against what that would mean for the costs of the stadium?
I don't believe any such analysis was done, no. I am aware that there has been analysis done of the economic benefit to London of hosting the World Athletics Championships, which has put it in the region of £200 million. You know, but obviously that was after the event.
Why was demolition never considered? When I say demolition of the seats, I'm not talking about the whole thing. Why was demolition never considered?
What, the lower bowl seats?
Of the seats?
They were demolished.
No, all the seats.
Well, one of
To allow reconfiguration.
Yeah, one of the options, no.
Sorry.
Oh, no. One of the options in the original consultation document, and again, going back to mine, was to go back to what was known inside the organisation as the Dust Bowl option. And the Dust Bowl option retained a 25,000 seat uncovered athletics track, which was, to be honest, would have been neither use nor ornament. No. But I don't think we went beyond answering your question. We didn't go beyond that to demolish the whole lot and start again.
That was the essence of the Spurs bid, was it not?
Well, the Spurs bid involved the full demolition of the stadium, and I suspect that had you demolished all the seats, it probably wouldn't have made a lot of sense to keep very much else.
Yeah. But the phrase, with respect, sir...
But apart from the Spurs bid, it was never considered?
No.
I know about the 25,000.
Sure. But you know, looking back, it was an iconic stadium which had brought huge credit to the UK in 2012. And so we didn't. No, you're quite right, we didn't.
Yeah, you give me £100 million, I'll show you some credit.
Okay.
So, did you, did at any time you feel that we should have removed the athletics track?
Did I personally feel at any time?
During the process of, I mean, because you were there from before the start almost, and
well,
surely on reflection, I'm just surprised that nowhere along the line did we ever consider that this athletics track was going to be, my view is the athletics track has caused all the problems, quite frankly. But did you ever at any time think that perhaps this athletics track wasn't such a good idea in the stadium?
I don't, I mean, as I say, and I've said this to you before, there were commitments made to the IOC and to the IAAF. And both mayors decided, you know, and they did obviously consider the matter, and both mayors decided that they wanted to honour those commitments. So
could the IOC have sued us?
Well, technically they could. They probably wouldn't have done. You know, there wouldn't have been. I very much doubt if they would have done. You know, that's not a decision I made to honour those commitments. I mean, you know fine well that...
Did you give advice to either mayor?
No, not on that issue, because you know well that there were many other people who held very strong views about this matter who would have spoken to both mayors about it. Prominent figures in the world of athletics and the world of sport.
I am absolutely convinced, and I know personally that the previous mayor at least put a lot of faith in your judgment in this, and I think I can't speak for him, but he would have personally put a lot of weight, I think, if you would have said to him, look,
Get rid of the athletics
get
track.
rid of the athletics track because it's going to be a problem for the future.
Well, maybe. I mean, who knows? I never said that to him. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced it would have been appropriate for me to say that to him. I think he was, you know, that issue was around. You were raising it at the time. Others raised it. He was aware of the issue.
These grey hairs.
He was aware of the issue. He took the view that he did. He didn't take it because I told him to. It was a view which he took. I'm sure he discussed it with ministers. I'm sure he discussed it with Seb Coe. And he took the view that he did.
Okay, Assembly Member Pigeon.
Thank you very much. It's been really helpful, actually, hearing from you both. So it reminds me a bit like listening to the reunion on Radio 4, just reminding ourselves of actually the context that all of this was going on. And I, in some ways, forgetting you've got the Secretary of State, ministerial level, rather than in here always thinking it's the mayoral decision. You had all those other pressures as well, and you had to deliver the games almost at any cost. And then it was the legacy afterwards. And also, following on from Assemblymember Boff's question, is actually Sebastian Coe's huge influence on insisting on athletics remaining there, which is in the room, perhaps not being spelt out. But one of the issues that comes up now time and time again, we've talked about the capital costs and what could have been done cheaper and so on, but now it's the ongoing running costs and everyday costs. And the thing that I find when I talk to people across London is they find it amazing, and what it certainly appears to be, that West Ham have this fantastic deal at the stadium, and almost anything that comes up, it's another cost for the taxpayer rather than West Ham. So can you explain who was responsible for negotiating the agreement with West Ham?
I think the form of the concession agreement was essentially determined. This is some time ago, but my memory fairly clearly about this is the form of the concession agreement was determined by the legal advice, largely by the legal advice that we had at the time from Allen and Overy. Bearing in mind that, we knew there was going to be litigation. We'd already had litigation. We knew Leighton Orient were going to issue further litigation. Rightly or wrongly, we basically did what the lawyers told us to do in terms of framing the concession agreement. And I don't think we had any choice. Now, whether their advice was right, but it did set very clear parameters for the agreement and for a concession basis for the agreement rather than a lease or anything like that. The main consideration was state aid, but there were other legal issues as well. There were issues about Newham's Viaries and all sorts of things. So, all I can say, Rick, to you really is that the structure of the agreement and the way that it worked was in substance determined by the legal advice that we had at the time.
So then, David, you as a board member, you're getting legal advice saying this is the only way to deal with all these complex issues and potential litigation. This is going to be the best deal for the taxpayer. Is that correct?
No, not quite. I think at the end of the day, this was the best deal we could get. To be honest, I'll be very honest, I felt that we were in a negotiating position that you never like to be in real life, do you? Where there's only one person on the other side of the table. There's only one person on the other side of the table who has got another option, i.e. not to do the deal. you at the end of the day have to take a balanced judgment on whether what you're being offered is acceptable. Now, we didn't think it was a bad deal for the taxpayer, because at that stage we had the other assumptions about income coming in from naming rights, income coming in from the other events, and we were looking at broadly in those days at the very least a break-even budget or even a small surplus. So we didn't think it was a bad deal for the taxpayer. On the other hand, I think many of us on the board at the time were worried that we were getting into a partnership based on a sum of money that actually, in terms of public criticism, that could well expose us to public criticism.
And I think if you look at the report, it talks about improvements that were made to the original proposition from West Ham during the course of the negotiation after they'd been made preferred bidder. Yeah. And there were some improvements. I think Moore Stevens said, well, maybe you could have improved other things. I mean, we were reliant on essentially the executive team at the LLDC and their advisors to negotiate this deal, and the legal advice that we had. I mean, it came down at the end of the day, as I say, I think it's on one of the pages of the report. I think, turn to it, on page 98 of the report, there's two options. There's the existing competition with retractable seating, or there's the do minimum multi-use option. And we had to make a judgment, I think, about whether the deal we were offered was good enough to avoid the very obvious disadvantages of that do minimum option, which still cost a significant amount of money, meant you couldn't do football in there, raised some doubts about whether it would be IAAF compliant, but essentially left all the temporary Olympic overlay as the only toilets and cafes and whatever to support the stadium. Obviously that was a bad outcome. I mean, rightly or wrongly, that we were concerned to get into the deal both some capital contribution from West Ham, which originally hadn't existed, and also there was concern that there should be provisions around the resale of the club by the owners of the club. And, I think those were pretty red lines in the negotiation. One of the things that Moore Stevens, I think, I don't agree with the way they put it, maybe just the way they put it, they say we never considered no deal. Well, I know that the people who were doing the negotiating did consider no deal. We very much considered no deal all the time. I think it would have been a mistake
Can we just probe a little bit further then on that? So if that was the case then, was that brought up to the people making decisions on or above the negotiation team to actually consider that? Was there at any time at an eye level in this organisation, in the LLDC, of where you come to the negotiations where you thought, actually, we're going to walk away?
I think this was almost constantly under discussion. So I think, as I say, I think what I've described, rightly or wrongly, as red lines, but they were big issues of concern around getting a capital contribution, around dealing with onward sale, some other, I think, lesser issues, which I can't really recall the detail of. Those would have been discussed in the LLDC board. It would have been said, we must get these things, otherwise we aren't going to do this deal. And I think, if your chief executive's having a negotiation, he needs to be able to go back and say, my board won't stand for this unless you do this. So they were brought to the LLDC board.
Every component of the deal was actually gone through by the investment committee and by the board. So we did look at it all at the end of the day, and we decided at the end of the day, I won't repeat the answer I gave before, that there was sufficient in it to proceed. Had there not been, I don't think we would have done. I think Neale was quite right. We would have reached a different view.
You weren't that happy with it, were you, by the sound of it?
I think a lot of us...
thought,
No,
this is a Premiership club coming in, really,
sure.
They ought to be paying more towards some of the costs of putting on the matches, the security, all the other things
Well,
in there.
I
And
mean,
there's no break clause. That's what I don't understand. There's
Well,
no
I mean,
break clause.
partly we were suffering from the thing I was talking about before as well, that we hadn't done the operator procurement, we didn't know the operating model and whatever. Because remember, the advice that we had, which, you know, hasn't turned out to be as accurate as we would have liked, was that when we looked at the operating costs, as they were estimated to be, when we looked at the sources of income, that we weren't going to be in the sort of deficit that we are now.
So it's a projected surplus position.
Yeah.
And that clearly hasn't been true. So you had advice on the operating costs, which again has proven to be wrong.
Yeah. And to be fair to the people advising us, they were giving that advice prior to the procurement of the operator.
Can I just come in
Yes,
again?
of course.
David, earlier you mentioned about partnership. Very straightforward in the world I live in. It's called a contract, an arrangement. It does seem that in negotiating, which is your key anchor tenant, that somehow that was missed of the importance of getting that bit right. And in your view, has that led to where the relationships that we're now dealing with now between that key anchor tenant and the various organisations, is it because we never got, whether we got the operating side and the other bits right, that's the legacy, if I can call it that, of where we are in terms of the relationship? Because it doesn't feel like a partnership, I suspect, from what we hear in the media. It doesn't feel like that people are working together for the same solutions. And there are key parts of this contract that was negotiated that don't seem to make sense for me, if I can use, you know, as a follower of football, and about sound management issues, about who does what around that. I can understand simplistically, and I think you said, Neale, about the governance arrangements, and I think earlier on about getting those bits right, who was taking what decisions, but the actual day-to-day operations of the stadium all flow from these contracts, or do they?
Well, I mean,
Some do.
partly. Some do, some don't. I mean, I don't think it... I mean, I start by a general thing, which is, I don't think it's right to say that at the core of all the bad relationships that such as exist is the contractual terms. I think there are all sorts of other reasons for that, and it's regrettable, and it's a fundamental issue that needs to be addressed. I think David's talked about the complexity of the arrangements, and if they could be simplified, I think we all think that would be a good thing. I think part of that simplification has occurred with the withdrawal of Newham from E20, which I think is a wholly good thing, probably. I mean, no criticism intended there of Newham, but just the simplification that's happened is a good thing. It makes it easier, I think, to manage. You've got one less party involved. I mean, there's no reason why these arrangements shouldn't work. You know, there really isn't. I mean, they work in Germany. You know, they work quite commonly. You know, where you have a stadium owner, an anchor tenant, and an operator. So I don't. I mean, I think that we did end up in this position where, because of, I think, legal advice and the concession type arrangement and whatever, we ended up in this position whereby the costs fell on the LLDC rather than on West Ham. And I think that is one point where you are correct about the difficulty, because that creates some tension, doesn't it? And I mean, I think we've seen that in recent days and weeks, haven't we? And around the stewarding issues and control and cost and all that. So there is something in what you say, but I don't think fundamentally the relationship problems are caused by the contractual arrangements.
If I might add, again, I'll be very honest, I think the contract was too long. I think there was too much detail in it. I think West Ham were very tough, very hard negotiators. And to go back to the point I made a moment ago, if you're sitting on one side of the table, you think you've got one person who's going to take the deal or not, you tend to make compromises, and you tend to get to the end of a process that you might not have wanted to be when you started. So I think we've got a contract that is too detailed, too lengthy, has got too much in it. That, I think, gives the people on the other side of the table the ability to question you a lot of the time about, are you fulfilling your side of the contract? And I remember some very interesting discussions with Karen Brady about the whole concept of look and feel, which I'd never really heard of before, but in the contract we promised to give the stadium the look and feel that the old stadium had had. Now, the interpretation of look and feel written in a contract between you and I may be quite different. So that did give the ability, did enable, I think, a lot of dissension to arise thereafter, and I think that did stem from the nature of the contract. So I think, again, looking back with hindsight, I would have gone much more for a partnership rather than this very strong legalistic contractual relationship.
If that had been achievable.
If it had been achievable, surely. I'm using my hindsight effect. Yeah. So you'd have looked at outcomes rather than a, if you like, a rules-based contract. We'd have gone for an outcomes-based deal, and we didn't get that in retrospect. I think that has been problematic, yes, sir.
I think it's interesting what you're saying. It reminds me of the PPP, which was it ended up just in litigation all the time because there was so much detail in the contract.
Yes.
It sounds like it's a similar one you've got there. But obviously your forecasts for all of this have turned out in hindsight to be wrong in terms of transformation costs, the ongoing profitability. Why were they so wrong? Is it just that you relied on expert advice that clearly wasn't expert advice, or is it just...
I think in respect of the transformation costs, I mean, I think to be fair, as I said, I think more Stevens actually say, well, it would have cost that. I mean, I actually think that's... I don't actually think you could have forecast that. I mean, I think you were in a position where, for example, the extent of the foundation and roof reinforcement works, to forecast those in advance and the extra costs that arose on that would have been very difficult. And you know, it could have been the other way. We might not have run into those issues around the roof reinforcement and the foundations. So on the capital side. On the revenue side, well, I mean, I think, you know, there are three, as I've said already, I think there are three main issues. I mean, there are some subsidiary issues. I think you come back to the seats, obviously. I think you come back to the naming rights. And, you know, I mean, I think all these are issues which, have at least partial solutions to them. In the case of naming rights, the obvious solution is you do a naming rights deal. And putting on more events in the stadium to bring in more money. I mean, you know, it is potentially, if both parties stand back, you know, and this is a very high level point, there is an absolute commonality of interest between GLA/LLDC and West Ham in the successful running of this stadium. You know, I mean, there should be enough common interest to actually look at ways in which things can be improved, and that needs to be discussed and worked through. But it absolutely ought to be possible because the common interest is very strong from West Ham's point of view and from the GLA's point of view, and that is about naming rights. It is about having more events. You know, I mean, let's be clear. I mean, the stadium has hosted some fantastic events. You know, I mean, you know, there have been millions of people in it. You know, there's concerts, the World Athletics Championships, the Diamond League events. I mean, you know, the Paralympic Championships. It has hosted. It is, from many points of view, a great stadium, and it could and should be used more often for other events. And you know, there are constraints on that because you've got a Premier League football club in there. So, you know, I think those issues can be addressed. I do come back to, you know, and I wouldn't want to be too harsh on the people who gave us the advice. It's very difficult to do this in advance of actually going to the market for an operator. It's very difficult to do this until you've actually got some hard evidence. I mean, there have been issues particularly around stewarding and security, pretty well known. Again, very difficult to get on top of that in advance, and particularly in advance of procuring an operator.
Can I, if I may,
Please do.
supplement that on the naming rights? And your question was, were we badly advised? I'm not sure how you do get advice that can be better than the advice that we got. We went to, just reminding myself of the names, IMG and ESP, two of the world's leading naming rights advisors. And I personally, I don't know, Neale, whether you were still there, sat through submissions by these very smartly suited young men and women telling us about 10, 20, 30 potential naming rights partners for us. And they gave us, you know, as a lay board member, I was amazed at the breadth of their knowledge. In fact, nothing came out of it. But at various stages, we were being told by these experts that the naming rights could be anything up to 10 or 12 million pounds.
And I think just on naming rights, just as we've got on to it, just to add to that though, I think it is worth saying that it is clear that LLDC have come close on 2 occasions to doing big naming rights deals. I mean, very close. I've no doubt there is a naming rights deal to be done. I think one characteristic of stadiums and naming rights is it can take time. I think if you look at Wembley, it took them quite a few years to do the deal they now have with EE at Wembley. I think if you look at the Juventus Stadium, they've just done a deal with Allianz, and they've been in their stadium 7 years trying to do a naming rights deal. I think Spurs are having some problems with naming rights now, and I think it will take time. I'm certain there is a naming rights deal to be done. I think talking to 1 or 2 people who are still at the LLDC, there's a view that following the World Athletics Championships and the success of that event, there is a lot of interest in that. I mean, there are, you know, to be, you know, let's be clear, I mean, doesn't some of the things which have been happening more recently don't actually help with that. But I think in due course, there is a naming rights deal to be done there.
I think I'm fine with that.
Okay, I've got a few tidy-up questions, and then I've seen Assemblymember Prince wants to come in, and maybe 1 or 2 others. On the naming rights thing, I'm not familiar with the deal that you described at Juventus. Is that aligned with their shirt sponsor?
I don't know.
Are you aware of any naming rights deals? Wembley Stadium is different because that's the national stadium, and although this season is slightly odd because Spurs are playing their home games there just for a year. But are you aware of any naming rights deals where a football club plays their home games where the naming rights of the stadium is not aligned with the shirt sponsor?
I don't know of any. I'm not saying that there aren't any. I mean, it's always the possible. Coming back to the partnership and the relationship, David probably knows a bit more about this than I do, but certainly in the, you know, there's never been a lack of willingness at LLDC to talk to West Ham about trying to sort out a joint naming rights deal. You've got to say that in any such discussion, there's going to be an issue, isn't there, which is that what's the split of the money?
Of course.
There's also a possible complicating issue in that, you know, it depends on individual mayors, but, you know, there's an issue about would LLDC be comfortable with certain sponsors who, you know, would they be comfortable with a betting company, for example? Probably not, I would have thought. So there are issues like that. But, you know, plainly it comes back, as I think it does with the other events point, to the relationship with the football club. And it would make a lot of sense, and I don't think there's ever been any unwillingness on LLDC's part, to try and do this together, but without a sort of brutal commercial approach to we're going to try and snaffle as much as we can, I mean, on either side, because that's not going to work. And I think it's, you know, as I say, I come back to the point that, you know, it's really important that the common interest that the public sector and the anchor tenant have is more reflected in the way they work together in the future.
And indeed, it's from memory, but my recollection is that that the deal on naming rights will want to be achieved does have a revenue share with West Ham once it is achieved. So it's not all going to the LLDC. I've forgotten whether it's the first 2 or 4.
No,
But
it's the first.
anyway, it's a significant share to West Ham once a deal is secured. And as Neale said, we did work very closely with West Ham on the appointment of ESP, the second bunch of naming rights advisors. So we took their advice on who to go to.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me that on the naming rights issue and on the rest of the stadium issues, West Ham have got to be part of the solution. I mean, any naming rights deal of the stadium, I would suggest to you, is more about the fact that there is Premiership football played there than the fact that it is the London Stadium. Therefore, you know, there would have to be some considerable commercial interest for West Ham in being involved in that and being beneficiaries of it. The Premier League is watched all around the world, and that is the point of somebody coming in and putting their name on the stadium. With that in mind, I mean, much of the mood music that we hear, certainly the impression that we get from the LLDC, is that West Ham is some kind of, or viewed by them as some kind of problem child, some kind of naughty tenant. Both of you are no longer within the LLDC. Do you think that that is a fair description?
I don't think it's a fair description of how LLDC view West Ham. I mean, David's talked about West Ham being tough negotiators, and they are, and they're entitled to be. You know, it takes two to make an argument. You know, I mean, I certainly wouldn't accept
To make a deal as well.
that there's a balance and 2 to do a deal, and that there's a balance on one side or the other. I mean, I also do think it's worth saying that certainly some of the advice I recall from the naming rights experts that we had were that although obviously a lot of the value is in the Premier League television, the fact that this was the Olympic Stadium and is linked with this project in the park more broadly, that is a significant premium factor in trying to do the naming rights deal. So, you know, and this is the sort of argument that the parties would be having over the split. All I'm saying is that at the end of the day, it ought to be possible to get a larger cake and split it up in a way that is reasonable.
I mean, to flip the question I just asked you a little bit, going into this deal, there was obviously a great deal at stake for West Ham United. I mean, we talk a lot about how, you know, West Ham were really the only game in town because it's a big stadium, it's in the East End, it's right in their hunting ground as far as it goes for supporters and local communities. But of course there was an awful lot at stake for them as well. This is a very big move. Leaving the Berlin ground with all the history, all the emotional attachment that their fans have for that is no small thing.
Absolutely.
And had I can't speak for West Ham, but if I had been negotiating for them, I would have been not at all interested in taking the risk that they took without a very long lease, without a break clause in it, because otherwise they don't have certainty. They can't go anywhere else.
Absolutely.
The Berlin ground doesn't exist anymore.
Absolutely.
No. Sorry to interrupt, the long lease was an essential part of their negotiation.
We'd never
questioned that.
Okay, and that's fine. But where I'm going with the question, though, is that every time there is any kind of press comment about the stadium, and there are politicians that mirror this sentiment as well as journalists, West Ham are consistently portrayed as the big bad wolf who've caused the problem, or the implication is that they have caused the problem, and that the taxpayer has been overly generous to West Ham, etc., etc. Do you think that's a fair characterisation?
I take the same view as you on this. I don't think it is fair to West Ham. I think you're right that they did take a substantial risk in doing this. You know, I think that for any football club to uproot itself from its home and do something else is a big, big deal. I mean, I've been watching the Arsenal for nearly 60 years, and we didn't move very far. And you know, these days people, you know, quite a lot of this has to do with the performance of the club on the pitch. So the number of people at Arsenal saying we should never have moved from Highbury has increased substantially with the recent poor performance of the club. And you know, it's a complicated thing, the relationship clubs have with their fans. And I absolutely understand why West Ham are anxious about that. It is a problem for them. It is difficult for them. You know, it plays off against the performance of the team and everything. And I don't see why, you know, let's be clear. I mean, you know, it ought to be possible to get this deal and these arrangements back into a place where it works for West Ham and the public sector. It ought to be possible to address the issues around the seats, around more events, around stewarding, all those issues. And I think I read the piece that Karen Brady wrote in the Evening Standard following the Moore-Stephens report, in which she said she wanted to work with the GLA and with the Mayor to make those improvements and to make changes. And it seemed to me, you know, if in the spirit in which she said that, if that could be reflected in the discussion, I mean, West Ham did give up their property. You know, they gave up their main asset, the bowling ground, and they are dependent on this. I think when you looked at their accounts, which came out recently, I think one of the things which I read, and I'm relying here on I think what was reported again in the Standard, they haven't made a mint out of the extra capacity at the Olympic Stadium, and that's because a lot of the pricing has been very keen to make sure that they sell all the seats. So, you know, the idea that this was a crock of gold to West Ham isn't fair. We know they've had the issues that there have been with stewarding, so they've suffered in a sense from the difficulties that there have been as well. So I absolutely don't think it's fair to be critical of West Ham or to present this as some crock of gold they've been given, because it ain't like that. So I would concur with what you say about that.
Could I just for once ever so very slightly add a gloss? It's slightly different.
Yeah.
My relationship generally was with Baroness Brady was very good at a personal level. I do actually think the gloss I put on Neale's remarks there is that there is a mentality inside West Ham that sees litigation as the first port of call.
Yeah, it's
and
not
you know,
helpful.
for a period we were almost getting a legal letter a week. I've not been there for 18 months, so I don't know now. So I do think in the give and take world that Neale has suggested, yes, it ought to be possible to run it, but I think it also needs a bit of a shift in attitude, going back my 18 months, in the behaviours of the West Ham side of the partnership.
I mean, you mentioned earlier on, in terms of the contracts, I wrote down what you said, it was too detailed, too lengthy and too much in it, and then you talked about things like the look and feel of the stadium, because that is one of the points at issue at the moment, as I understand. I went to the Boleyn ground on numerous occasions, not as many as certain other members here. I was there for the last ever game there. I wasn't too happy with the result of that game, actually, as it happens. But I've also been to the new stadium in Legacy Mode with West Ham playing there. And I can say with a fair degree of certainty that looks nothing like the West Ham United ground that I've seen. There are a few concessions to them. The bubble machine is there. And there are a few things around names of ends and things like that. But it doesn't feel like West Ham United's ground. The pitch surround, for example, which I understand is another issue that has become what seems to me to be an almost pointless bone of contention, particularly since West Ham have offered to pay for a new pitch surround. Why are things like this becoming so much of a sticking point? I mean, surely these are things you can sort out with a 5-minute conversation. I don't understand why this has become such a big issue. Can you shed any light on that?
No, not really is the answer. I mean, I left the board October, whenever it was, nearly 2 years ago. I mean, I've been to both grounds as well. I've been to the Boleyn ground as a supporter of Fulham, and you were tucked in a nasty little corner in rather squalid accommodation, unable to get a beer. And as a visiting supporter, I think that the new stadium is infinitely better. I mean, whenever I went into it, I thought it did have a pretty good aura of the club. I think the efforts we went in terms of the video screens and all of that went a long way. And I don't know whether look and feel is still an issue. I was using that as an example of some of the contractual disputes that arose when I was still there.
I mean, I do think that, you know, a lot of what you say, Gareth, is I mean, I can understand why there's frustration around these issues. I mean, I think, you know, this all goes to the fact that, you know, at a very senior level, people need to improve this relationship, doesn't it?
Exactly.
I mean, you know, because it is a problem. There are issues on both sides, no doubt. But I mean, that if that isn't addressed and solved, then getting into the minutiae and the detail of resolving, stewarding costs, of sorting out more events and so on, if you don't create that better relationship, you won't succeed in addressing those issues.
Well, I mean, in light of that then, the Moore Stephens review, as we've discussed, it took slightly longer than we originally indicated that it would do. I mean, this committee, amongst others, brought pressure to bear on that. And I understand the Mayor's Chief of Staff had to bring them in and basically say, look, we need this review completed as soon as possible. The Mayor issued a colourful press release to accompany the Moore Stephens review in December and talked about taking personal charge of the situation and sorting it all out. Do you find it surprising, therefore, that neither he nor your successors as the chair of the LLDC has yet met with Karen Brady?
I'm a little reluctant to be critical of them because I don't know what their reasoning for that is, and hopefully
I think it's them. I think it's really well.
Hopefully, such meetings will take place. They need to, but I don't know why that should be. But I'm not party to.
And there lies the issue, isn't it? If we go back to look and feel, I'm a supporter, and anyone who follows football will understand that. There's some look and feel I don't want from the bowling ground. I'll tell you that. The toilets and all the rest of it as the club has run down. But equally, let's take it away from the emotion of football supporters and talk about a contract. Putting look and feel into a contract almost says it's going to be tested by the courts, that some judge is going to have to arbitrate about what look and feel is if you're in dispute, isn't it? I'm not sure, I wouldn't want to be that judge, do you know what I mean? And let's say, for my sake, it might be a football supporter who might understand what look and feel is. So I don't understand how those things, even in negotiations, crept into a contract or were not bottomed out within that contract about what we meant. So I think what we can say about the stadium is the colour of the seating is one issue. There is some attempt in the outer ring about putting some colours up. I think the wraparound, if I can call it, it's not quite a wraparound, but if you know what I mean, that the stadium does on match days presents that, the overall decorations around. But clearly there are more things, but there is, I don't understand how that got into a contract without some bottom line of what it was then about that look and feel. How does that work? And I suppose the point I'm coming to, has the relationship really got to go through litigation before it gets better, in your experience, in terms of where you were involved?
Well, it absolutely shouldn't.
Yes.
I mean, there's no purpose in litigation. Once you're in litigation, you had it. The lawyers have got hold of you, and you're never gonna get anywhere. I mean, it's very regrettable that there should be litigation. It's difficult for me because we're not involved, either of us now. We don't know the stuff that's going on. It's difficult for us to comment or to say somebody should be doing this or somebody should be doing that. That is a very high level point, unless you, however you do it, and it does need senior involvement, unless you get hold of this relationship and improve it and stop people sending legal letters and going off to court, you're never going to get anywhere. So both parties surely ought to see that. I mean, I can't, in any other walk of life, in the property world or something, which I know, obviously people sue each other from time to time, but they don't normally try and do that or conduct their relationship like that. They try and resolve things through sensible, common sense negotiation and give and take. And that's what's needed here.
And just the last question, really, in this section before we move on. So E20 as the operating company stroke delivery vehicle for the LLDC to deliver the stadium and for this mayor to deliver it. We've got new about the picture, which you said simplifies issues. Really, is it E20 then in relation to some of the other contracts, the stadium stewarding contract, the catering contract? Is that one of their tasks as you see it from Moore Stephens, of getting to grips with this, and you know, is it really fit for purpose, or was it fit for purpose in the past? From what we know with hindsight,
Can I
I think
have a
you were
first?
there.
You have a first.
What's your thinking around that?
Okay.
Considering the main anchor tenant contract was done before, as we talked about, before some of these operating issues were in. What's your thinking of that? What could you help this committee to understand about the future?
Sorry, let me go back. E20 was invented as a mechanism to create a joint partnership between Newham and the LLDC with a 40% Newham shareholding. If that's now gone, the E20 board members, of whom I was one, were actually delegated to their job by the LLDC board. We didn't take, the three of us, any decisions on the E20 board unless they'd been through the LLDC investment committee and we had the authority of LLDC behind us. That was a view that the three of us took because we didn't want to be in a different statutory fiduciary responsibility. My own view, for what it's worth, and again I've only read more Stevens and Mayor's press notice, my own view is I would wrap up E20, I'd bring it back into the LLDC, and I'd probably go further than that if it's going to be run by the Mayor's office and the GLA, create a single unit, because if you've got every LLD decision going forward that has to be brought to the Mayor, why not bring it in-house and run it from now on as part of the GLA or part of the Mayor's office? But that's a very simplistic response, and I think the LLDC wouldn't like that because it would take the management of the stadium out of the greater concept of the park. However, as all of the concept, the big schemes going forward in the park are still subject to mayoral approval of various kinds, I'm not sure that's a totally compelling argument against what I'm proposing. But Neale, you probably take a different view.
I'm not sure that I'm not sure I would do that. I mean, but I don't feel strongly about it. I mean, the critical thing though is making sure that the capacity and capability to do it is there. And again, I'm a bit blind to that now. I think in the Mayor's press release there was reference to a sort of turnaround appointment that had been made, and I'm not sure I have no idea what's happening about that, but obviously that was a sensible sort of thing to do. So, I mean, whoever is running this operation or taking responsibility for the stadium and its future, whether that's within the GLA or whether it's within the LLDC, then obviously you need to have people of sufficient capacity and capability to do that job. Now, in the past, I mean, I've known people, who were at the LLDC who were responsible for this, who, in my experience, were pretty good and competent people. But that's clearly important, and beefing that up may be something that one needs to think about in the short run. I understood that was really what was being talked about when it was said that this turnaround person had been brought in. Now, obviously, they presumably are engaged on a programme of work to that end. Again, I really don't know anything about that. So I don't think it matters quite so much whether it's in the LLDC or whether it's in the GLA. I can see an argument for it being in the GLA if that means it's going to get even greater priority and attention, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay. Right, so Member Prince, and then we need to move on.
You've sort of touched on the areas I was looking at anyway, to be honest, but just, I don't want to talk about where we are now. It is a bit of a mess, but I don't expect you to really comment on there. I don't think it's fair. You're not in the business. But I think you said earlier that the model, the operating model, works in Germany, where you have an owner, an operator, and a tenant. But this model isn't that, is it? You've got sort of an owner, and then another sort of an owner, and then you've got somebody else who's doing the dog work. And why was it so complicated in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's I do think that's a perfectly fair and correct question, good question. And I think every individual decision that was made, you can give probably a good explanation for why it was done in that way. I mean, the fundamentals of the agreement were necessary because of legal advice. The E20 had to be set up because we needed £40 million from Neale to do the work to the stadium. And clearly that they needed some way in which they could come in and have influence, therefore, over the stadium. I think it was right to go for an external operator rather than to try and create an in-house team to run something as complicated as a stadium. I mean, all the other venues in the park, most of which run pretty successfully, are run by external operators. So, as I say, each individual piece, in the time that was available, and I go back to a point I made that I think one of the things that did create difficulty is just the fact that you didn't do the operating model and the operating stuff first. I think it needs to be simplified. I think it needs greater clarity. I think part of that, as I've already said, is achieved by having just the GLA stroke LLDC, there. And I mean, maybe you need to clarify because of the confusion about LLDC and the GLA. I mean, this is a huge London asset. So the more we talk about it, the more I'm thinking maybe David is right and it should come in-house into the GLA and get managed here. But, that's plainly a decision for the mayor and people at LLDC to think about, make their own judgment on. And I do think that there needs to be some simplification in relation to the way in which the stadium is operated. But that can only be done now through negotiation and discussion between the GLA and West Ham. It can't be done any other way.
Again, I'm not asking you to comment on where we are now, but would it not be fair to say that part of the reason why we are where we are now and there's all this litigation flying around is because poor old West Ham didn't know who they were talking to. I mean, they could talk to the old LLDC or talk to E20 or talk to LS185, and there must be real issues around command structure, who's making the real decisions. I dare say that LS185 have probably got the contracts, but they haven't got the ability to vary the contracts and so on. So all this confusion has probably compounded and made a big contribution to where we are now. Although I'm not asking
sorry, I don't think with respect, I don't think it's made a big contribution to where we are now and some of the big issues we've talked about. But I actually fundamentally agree with your basic proposition that running the thing on a day-to-day basis is much more difficult because West Ham are dealing with those three different agencies and the Mayor's office and the GLA as well. I think it's tough for them, and I have sympathy for them in trying to work their way through that. By now, though, it has been going for 2 or 3 years, and they've got pretty good lines of communication with the various bits, but it's too complex. I agree.
Surely that's the point, though. Is I'm not saying they haven't got lines of communication. I'm sure they have, but it's trying to find who the decision maker is. Well, in any business, when you use the example, I think Neale earlier about in property and how it works in property. Well, my knowledge of that is that you have a developer and you usually have to engage with the local council, and usually that's the planning department and in the worst case scenario the chief exec or the leader. But it's very easy to understand who's making the decision and who's got the right to make the decisions. In the setup that we have here, I would think that it's probably quite difficult. I could make another analogy.
Well, I mean, again, the fundamental point is I think we agree with you about simplification and clarity, if that could be achieved, but it needs a will on all sides to change things. I mean, I wouldn't have thought there ought to be that much confusion by now on West Ham's part about who is the decision maker on different issues.
Can I just ask you, when you were involved with, was there a SPOC, a single point of contact that West Ham could contact and know that they were dealing with the right person? Was there a SPOC, and is there a? I don't know if there is one now.
Yes, Baroness Brady dealt with me directly all the time.
Well, I mean, people at various levels. On a day-to-day basis, there was, you know, a team that was working then for E20 and a person in charge of that team. So for day-to-day matters, it was quite clear who you spoke to. There was a single, I can't remember his name, what was his name? But there was there was a single person there. I mean, obviously you have got LS 185 there, and again, I can't speak for them, I don't know the detail of it, but I would have thought it was pretty clear who was responsible in that organisation for different things. But I mean, it depends on the issue, doesn't it? I mean, some issues are always dealt with at working level. Bigger, more fundamental issues, you know, you need to escalate, but that's not an uncommon situation in any walk of life. I mean, I don't think it would have been right for LLDC, and I don't think it would be right now for LLDC or the GLA to try to run the stadium through an in-house operation. I think assembling the skill and the ability to do that in the public sector is probably not something you should try to do. So I think you are faced with a situation where you are likely to continue to have an external operator as well as LLDC. If there's a lack of clarity in who's saying what, then that does need to be addressed.
Of course, there is a certain irony, isn't there, that there is one of the partners who's very experienced in running a stadium and running the operation and running stewarding, and that is West Ham.
Well, I mean, you know, clearly, you know, and I'm very line behind your question, there is an option, you know, and there is an option that could be done whereby West Ham would operate the stadium. Clearly that could be an option. It would require a fundamental renegotiation of all the agreements. I'm not saying that would necessarily be a bad thing. It would be essential in any such process that both parties benefited from that renegotiation.
So there is really, you can see a situation where it would be where the LLDC would pay West Ham to run the stadium.
You know, I mean, again, you would have to renegotiate the contractual arrangements.
Yeah.
There would be issues about who decided what other events went on there, about who all the decisions that have to be made around it. But it would be possible. It would be possible to do it like that. Absolutely.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you conceded the point. The next point I want to make very quickly. I think you conceded the point to Gareth, but Gareth did make the point quite well that, you know, whenever the media talk about the stadium and what's going on, stadium actually, that you know, West Ham always come across as the nasty people who, you know, are ripping off the taxpayer. The question I would have is around negotiation. I mean, is it West Ham's fault that they're excellent, very professional negotiators, and to be as polite as I can, you weren't? I actually don't agree that I mean, I think what more Stevens say, and it's correct, is that because of where we were, West Ham had a very strong position in the negotiation, and you can't do away with that. You can do the best you can. West Ham aren't to be blamed for trying to negotiate the best deal they can. You know, I think we talked about this earlier. There was always going to be a judgment to be made about whether we had negotiated a good enough deal for the public sector to sign up to it. I mean, you might say, I mean, the people who were working on the deal, could they have done better? I suspect not. So I don't think that means they were bad negotiators. I think it reflects the position that we were in and the judgments that were made at the time about what the key negotiating points were going to be. And as I say, they tended to be around making West Ham put something into the capital costs and resolving the potential dangers of the club being sold and people walking away with a load of money. Now, those improvements, and there are other improvements mentioned here, were achieved in the negotiations that the LLDC executive carried out, and that strategy, as I've already said, came back to the board. So no, you know, it was a negotiation. You know, let's be clear. I mean, you know, looking at the situation now,
you know, West Ham, you know, they've got issues with their supporters, which they were bound to have. They've got all sorts of issues around their move into this stadium. So no one's saying that they've found themselves in, you know, a land of milk and honey.
The point I wanted to get to, though, actually was, I believe you said that you, around the negotiation, you did what your lawyers said, basically. I think that was the phrase you used. I wrote it down. But did you have a professional negotiating team working for you? Did you go to the market and find professional negotiators, or who were you using to negotiate?
Well, we had an executive team of, you know, highly experienced people who many of whom had been involved in negotiating very difficult commercial issues in relation to the Olympic Games, because most of our senior people at one stage or another worked on the Games. These were experienced and competent people. I don't think for a moment that I think Moore Stevens doesn't expressly say it's not a question that West Ham out-negotiated people. Yeah. I mean, there was a difficult negotiation, you know, I don't think any blame should, you know, I don't think we should be saying that the people who are involved day to day doing those negotiations did a bad job. I think they did the best job they could in that situation, and as they say, they achieved the improvements that were regarded as critical. Would it have been better if we could have negotiated more money from West Ham? Could we have got, you know, 30 or 40? Obviously, that would have been great, but we weren't going to get that. And it wouldn't have mattered. It wouldn't have mattered how brilliant they were.
So you were happy with the negotiation as it was. You were happy with the
Well, I think we tried to say this earlier, that, you know, we weren't brilliantly happy, but we were in this difficult negotiating position with one party. We would have preferred to be. You always prefer in a negotiation to have the spur of competition and to be able to play parties off against each other.
But the bottom line is that it's not West Ham's fault that they got a good deal, is it?
I don't think I said it.
I don't think either of us have said that it's West Ham's fault. I don't think it was.
I'm keen to move this on now.
You know,
I think, right, members, we've been going at this for more than 2 hours, and whilst I'm sure we could all come back and have another bite of this particular cherry, I'm very keen that we move it on to the next section. So I'm going to ask Assembly Member Desai to take off on that one.
Thank you, Chair. 2 questions to both of you. So coming to the present Mayor, when he took office, did he talk to you about his plan for a stadium? And if so, what did he say? And secondly, conversely, what advice, if any, did you give to the Mayor in his first month of office? And if you did advise him, did he follow your advice?
I was only here working for the present Mayor for about 3 weeks. So, you know, and to be honest, all I can recall is that in that period, we had an introductory meeting where he met with David Goldstone, the LLDC Chief Executive, with David here. I was in that meeting, and it was an introductory meeting. And, you know, David can probably say better than I the issues that they ran through. I then subsequently wasn't involved in giving advice to the Mayor.
If I may, can I very briefly, Chair, just quote, I wrote to the Mayor on the 9th of May with a series of annexes about the work of the LLDC. I said the following: the 4th annex is a briefing on the stadium. It has amazing potential to be at the focus of a wide range of sporting and other activity. But as we finalise transformation works and the stadium becomes fully operational for the first time, there are still challenges over capital costs and future running costs. It, of course, has been a political issue in which the media has taken a close interest. The leadership of the principal tenant, West Ham United, is highly demanding. That's what I said to the Mayor on his first day in office. I didn't give him any further advice or have any further discussion with him until I left my job.
You wrote to him. Did he reply back?
We had, as Neale said, we had a meeting 3 or 4 days after he was, and we ran through what his agenda was likely to be. But my recollection is I didn't give him any further advice on the future of the stadium. No.
Okay, Assembly Member Arnold.
Neale, because from your CV, you're a sticker and you get results. So, in terms of the appointment with Mayor Khan, what was it? Was it a bad spec that it was after 3 weeks you said, oh, I can't do this, I've made a mistake? I mean, the Evening Standard says that
Sadiq Khan dealt blow.
said that Sadiq Khan was dealt a blow, as if to say you walked away, you walked out of the relationship.
No, I mean, I think, you know, I wouldn't want to. All I think I'd want to say about that is that, you know, I wasn't able to agree with the mayor a long-term role in his administration. I mean, for whatever reason, I wasn't able to. And to be honest, unless I had been able to agree a long-term role, I took the view that, you know, I didn't want to continue, you know, on a sort of temporary basis. I wanted to go and do other things.
Okay, yeah, fine, straight. So we've got that on record. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you. David, how much engagement did you have? I mean, you talked about the letter and the appendix that you wrote to the mayor on his first day. How much engagement did you have with him in the 6 months that you were still in post while he was mayor?
We had the meeting that I've just described. I had regular meetings with the chief officer, or what's called Jeff Jacobs, and the finance director. I didn't see the mayor again.
Did you see anyone, because Jeff Jacobs obviously is the head of paid service at the GLA, he's not in the mayor's office. Did you see anyone in the mayor's office in that
I saw
time?
David Bellamy on a couple of occasions when we were talking about budget, I think, going forward. I saw Jules when we were talking about, and David indeed, when we were talking about restocking the LLDC board. A series of appointments were due at around the turn of the year, I think, and I was involved in discussions with both David and Jules over that.
Did you have any substantial discussions about how the stadium was being run?
Not with the mayor, I did with Jeff.
Yeah, Jeff is, said it's...
Yeah, I know, sure.
Okay, so what... So in May 2016, Sadiq Khan gets elected. In November 2016, you decided to resign. What was the cause of that?
I think I never commented on why I resigned. They were for...
That's what I'm asking you.
Indeed, they were for personal reasons. Mm-hmm. I've always done jobs where I felt I was making a difference. I've chaired a number of organisations. By the autumn time, I felt I wasn't really making a difference. To be honest, I also felt, and if you were to look at the media at the time, some of the media stuff at the time, the LLDC and the stadium had become a little bit, the stadium really become a bit of a ping-pong match between the Foreign Secretary and the Mayor of London, and I decided being a ping-pong ball was a little bit above my pay grade.
Okay, I think that's quite a revealing answer. Thank you for it.
It's an honest one.
Indeed, I'd like to have that in a second. Assemblymember Boff, you indicated?
How often did you request a meeting with the mayor, Mr. Edmonds?
I'm not sure I did request a meeting with the mayor.
So, but in that 6-month period, you met the mayor once. You met David Bellamy a couple of times.
Yeah.
A couple is right.
Well, probably more than that, but
more than that.
I can't remember it.
Or a fourth. And you met with Jeff Jacobs.
And the finance director. And of course, yeah.
And during that period, what was being negotiated? What big deals were taking place in that 6 months? Was there anything of substance to it?
Yeah, I think we were talking about particularly the cultural sector, the development on the island site, and clearly at official level, we were talking about the stadium and how it was being run.
And were there any issues with relationships with what was going on in the stadium at the time? Whether everybody was...
What kind of relationships?
Well, was there any substantial breakdown in any communication between E20 and anyone else?
I don't think so. No, E20 was fully integrated into the workings of the LLDC. And I think the LLDC was pretty fully integrated into the workings of the GLA.
6 months and only once to see the mayor on such a major project. That seemed, was there nothing that you wanted to raise with the mayor about the stadium? Or indeed the whole Olympic Park?
I think that if the mayor's office had wanted to talk to me about those issues, they could very happily have asked me in. I don't, on the whole, think it's the job of the chair of whatever we would call a subsidiary body, particularly as I was having good, strong working relationships into the at official level.
Thank you very much.
That's all right.
Thank you. Just to close that particular point, the mayor had been in office for 6 months and you'd met him once. You referred to the newspaper coverage that immediately preceded your resignation. The mayor made some very robust remarks in some of that press coverage. And you're saying that he made those remarks without having called you in to discuss them with you or to discuss the situation with you. Is that a fair summary of what
With
you
me at a
said?
personal level, he may well have, his office may well have talked to my office, myself about it, yes.
But the mayor had not met you and spoken to you about, because what triggered it was the apparent revelation that there was going to be another cost for the retrofitting of the stadium, wasn't it? And he hadn't picked the phone up or asked you for a meeting or anything like that?
No.
Okay. Right.
But, sorry, can I just talk, I mean, the cost thing, I mean, there was no question at any stage of the LLDC not telling the GLA what was happening. I think the cost issues became very apparent in the October time, particularly in terms of the seating costs, and I think that could well have been a trigger, yes.
Bearing in mind then that cost was known and wasn't a shock, or shouldn't have been a shock to anybody in this building, do you feel that the...
Sorry, to say, well, it became known in October. I think
Yeah.
it probably was a shock, the extent of, the £8 million number that emerged in October. I think probably that did surprise people, yes.
Okay. Do you feel that the press coverage that followed it was a fair description of events and circumstances?
I probably wouldn't like to comment on that if you don't mind.
Okay, that's fair enough. I can understand why you wouldn't. Moving off that subject, to both of you, bearing in mind what was known and the situation that was in play from May 2016 until now, what is your assessment of how the Mayor's office has handled the stadium issue?
You mean just now? You mean it since...
Well, the Mayor's been the Mayor for 2 years,
Yeah.
and we are where we are now.
Well, I think that's quite a difficult question to expect me to answer, because I don't really have any direct knowledge, of what the Mayor's office as such has been doing or not doing.
Because, the reason for asking the question, it goes back to a question that I asked you earlier on. 4 months ago, the Moore Stephens Review was published with some very robust commentary from the Mayor. A lot of it was focusing on how he was going to take personal charge of this situation and sort it all out. And he has not yet met Baroness Brady, which seems extraordinary. I gather they are, from what I read in the press, there is a meeting that's been arranged for next week. But I gather that the trigger for that may have been the unrest that there was in the stadium to do with stewarding,
Yeah.
etc., a couple of weeks ago. It seems very surprising to me that 2 years into office, with a stadium that's been losing money, which has had well-trailed problems, and a promise that he was going to take personal charge and solve it, that he hasn't even taken the initial step of seeing the chief person at West Ham United to start talks on this. Do you find that surprising?
I think I really do think it's difficult for either of us to comment on that, since we're no longer, engaged or involved in events. We don't know what the turnaround people are doing. We don't know if people are preparing for that meeting and want to get various things done before they have it. I mean, I think you need to ask for people you're raising questions about those questions rather than us, probably.
Yeah, I think we very much will do that. David, did you want to add to that?
No, thank you.
Okay, I'm not very good at tempting people today, evidently. Okay.
Depends what the temptation is.
All right, well, to close the meeting off then, to give you the opportunity to answer a hypothetical question, if you were still in post, either of you, what would you be advising the Mayor to do now?
I would certainly, in terms of the stadium, I think I'd revert to my previous answer. I think many of you have asked questions which point to the complexity of the current arrangements. It's not just who you talk to, it's the fact if you've got 4 people involved in an organisation, even if you know the right people are, they've got different interests. So LS185's interests are different from E20's interests. E20's interests are different. It's just too complicated. So I would certainly be suggesting massive simplification. I would almost certainly be suggesting you take the role of the LLDC board out of it, because you've got another supervening or intervening layer, and I'd be having a single, if you like, project manager sitting somewhere inside, I guess, this building, running the various complexities of the stadium. I think that's the advice I've been giving.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure about the taking it out of LLDC. I mean, you have got a well set up organisation there that's on site, that's dealing with everything else in the park. I can see the argument, though. I mean, I suppose any simplification, any change is going to require a fundamental look at all the agreements, and I think that in a sense, if the meeting that we've been talking about, meeting that hasn't happened, is being carefully prepared to set up that sort of discussion, then that's probably a good thing. I think the improvement in this relationship, I've said it several times now, we all know that, we've got to make strides there. It really ought to be possible. I mean, as I say, that this oughtn't to be so adversarial, and I think you've got to accept that that's a message to both parties in this relationship, and that needs to be solved, and it can only be solved by the principals in the organisation. That's the way things work.
Right, we have reached the conclusion of this part of the meeting. Can I thank you both very much indeed for your attendance and your answers.
Excellent answers.
Yeah, it's been quite an illuminating couple of hours. We've got a couple of other items of business to do, which we will speed through very quickly, so please don't feel we need to leave just now. Members, we are recommended to note, members, can we have one meeting, please?
They're visitors, we're the members.
We are recommended to note the report and the discussion. Can we do that?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 3 is the GLA monitoring reports. We are recommended to note the covering reports and the information. Thank you. Item 7, Mayor's decision lists. We are recommended to note those.
Noted.
Are there any members that we want to refer to the Budget and Performance Committee for detailed consideration?
Nothing.
Thank you. Payments over £250. We are recommended to note that.
Okay.
Date of the next meeting is scheduled for the 11th of July 2018 at 2 o'clock in this room. subject to the confirmation of the annual meeting of the Assembly on the 10th of May 2018. There is no any other urgent business. So I
Except to
declare-
say, thank you very much for your excellent sharing for the year. It's made this meeting so interesting, I'm going to put it as my #1 favourite.
Oh, stop it.
We note that. That's marvellous. And with that, thank you very much. I declare the meeting closed.
Definitely coming back to budget.